Well, welcome everyone to today's panel. We're titling this panel When Data Science Meets Social Science, Building Digital Spaces That Enable Peace. My name is Avira Zakam. I am a senior technical advisor with Dexis Consulting Group, among other places. And just wanted to tell you a little bit first about Dexis, as well as introduce our esteemed panel and kind of tell you a little bit about what we're going to be doing today as part of this virtual panel. Again, thank you. I know PeaceCon has been going on. This is the second day. I know we're doing this all virtually, so I'm just immense first gratitude for everyone joining us virtually. I know everyone already has some virtual fatigue, if you will, from our lives being that we are still kind of living in a pandemic. So immense gratitude and thank you for joining. So first, just to tell you a little bit about Dexis. Dexis is a professional services firm that helps solve today's most pressing challenges to create a more secure and prosperous world through their staff of more than 500 employees active across 18 countries. Dexis advances the mission of leading global engagement agencies, including USAID, the State Department, Defense, Health and Human Services. And Dexis specializes in stabilization and conflict mitigation, security sector assistance, rule of law, anti-corruption, and inclusive economic growth. So before I tell you a little bit about how we're going to be doing today virtually, I do want to introduce some pretty fantastic folks that have been assembled here. First, Norik Salimi. He's the founder of Pegasus Strategy Insights. It's a North Macedonian technology firm bringing more than 10 years of expertise in media monitoring and analysis across Albania, Bosnia and Herzegovina, Kosovo, North Macedonia, and Ukraine. Pegasus proprietary software allows it to extract and derive insights from online media in multiple languages through Western Balkans. Norik has partnered with organizations from USAID to local media outlets to create initiatives that prevent disinformation and hate speech in the region. Kate Duffy is a fellow with Digital Forensics Lab in the Atlantic Council. She has over 2 decades of experience supporting international engagement between civil society and the private sector on building rights-respecting technological tools and practices with a particular focus on open source tools and teams. As Vice President for Global Technology Programs at Internews, she led the strategy, technical approach, and institutional learning around technology across Internews work globally and oversaw an extensive portfolio of foreign assistance programming focusing on digital safety and digital rights, anti-censorship technologies, and direct technological support to civil society media partners. She currently serves as a non-resident fellow at the Atlantic Council's Digital Forensic Lab and previously served on the board of directors of the Global Network Initiative and the expert advisor of the World Economic Forum's Partnering with Civil Society in the Fourth Industrial Revolution Initiative. And last but certainly not least, Derek Ruths. He's the chief architect at the Charitable Analytics International. And he helps social good initiatives use data and analytics to achieve greater reach and greater impact. As the chief architect of CAI, Dr. Ruths has completed pioneering research on gender disinformation, developed methodologies for building lexicon and tracking hate speech, as well as tactics for network mapping and data analysis. In collaboration with the National Democratic Institute, he's now working to understand the impact of shocks on the information space and the potential of proliferation of hate speech, gender disinformation, and other forms of online abuse in a context such as Brazil and Lebanon. So as you can see, we have some very interesting folks joining us, which I think is going to be a really, really great conversation. So just wanted to tell you a little bit about some of the things that we're going to be talking about and sort of the how we're going to do it for everyone, and then we'll kind of go in. So first, you see on your screen, we're going to give you an audience poll about some of the questions that we want to really engage with you to really understand what's on your mind in terms of how do we build private-public partnerships to create more safe spaces online to counter and address online harms for peace. We will then turn to panelist presentations. We've asked each panelist to really give their perspective. Would love to then engage with you to really just respond to the presentations and really understand what's on the top of mind. We'll then have a facilitated discussions and conversations. So just if there's anything that we hope we'll touch on and we hope that you'll get away from this conversation is really about What are the best partnerships for those that understand the context, because how much local context is important on these issues? How are we dealing with localized tools and how important localized tools are to this sets of issues? Digital forensics, and just also the fact that there's sometimes absence of violence during election period does not mean that there's a healthy relationship between civil society groups and digital platforms. And then really thinking about with that shared understanding, what can each sector, both civil society, what from the digital platform space, and even from the local governments, folks can do to really shape the conversation online and implement solutions that we create digital spaces in countries all over the world. So without further ado, let's turn to the audience poll. I just would love to engage with all of you. I see there's been a number of folks that have joined. So first question, please. And you should have a prompt to answer this question. So if you can answer the question, in your country or context, do you know the primary technology partners that work to address disinformation online harms? Wow. Okay. It's fascinating. Waiting to see how this actually shapes up. Let's give it a few more minutes. Oh, a minute rather. Okay. So interestingly enough, we see the answer here, 24% yes, and it's changing a little bit, but about, it looks like 70-ish percent no, which to me that says that education and the access part is also really important to this set of issues. Okay, next question. Okay, so then on a scale of 1 least to 5 most, how do you use artificial intelligence, data science? You can also think about machine learning or other emerging tech in your conflict prevention and mitigation programs. Please provide multiple choice. Do we have any answers yet? I do not actually see the responses. So it looks like it's a 52%, so it's a lower scale. Okay. Okay, next question. So the next question is, what are the primary divisive online harms that your country and context faces? Okay. Okay, let's see how this shakes out. We're still working on the numbers, I can see. Okay, I think this is more or less settled. It looks like the primary divisive online harms are certainly disinformation. And again, I think terminology here is important because I think often people confuse disinformation and misinformation. By disinformation, we're talking about the intentional spread of malicious information online, but by malicious actors. And then misinformation is often malign spread of information by anyone really, by citizens, anyone. And then that's also really interesting that how much is hate speech is really prevalent in your countries, which is different. And obviously, hate speech leads often associated with hate and harassment, and all of these things. One of the reasons we're talking about all of this is that it has the propensity or the possibility to cause real world harm, and has real world harm implications. So that's also very interesting. So 75% for disinformation, 54% of misinformation, and 58% of hate speech. Next one. And here's the results. Okay. Where do you turn to first to prevent, detect, or mitigate disinformation and other online harms? Let's see your answers. Can we see the results? It's looking like tech companies is the most, followed by civil society, which is interesting. Like, I think that's really interesting that tech companies is the most, because um, it depends on your experience and also who you talk to, whether you turn to tech companies to for information, how to report disinformation, misinformation, abuse, and hate speech, and who to partner with. It also depends on the segment of civil, it's on the segment that you're coming from, and of course, civil society. Okay, next. So, on a scale of 1 least and 5 most, how familiar are you with digital safety tools and tactics? Okay, just give it one more minute. It's actually a very interesting split. So it looks like that about 30%, 37% answer three, that they're sort of familiar, but the most, if being familiar with digital safety tools, is really only 11%, with 21% least. So that kind of goes to show, that also tells me about how much the community also has a responsibility to inform and educate about what are the digital safety tools, and how do we actually prevent online harms as well. Um, okay, so this was very illuminating and very interesting to me, just to get a perspective. And here's the results from the audience. Get really, great perspective from the audience, and in terms of their familiarity with in terms of familiarity with both digital safety and what do they consider are uh, the main issues at hand. So, without further ado, I would love to turn the presentations, and would love to start with Norik. And he is going to talk a little bit about how do we build an effective stream of valuable data to monitor digital conversations, among other topics. So, Norik, take it away.
So, hello everyone. Thank you so much for being with us today. I want to thank Dexis for letting me be here with you, with this lovely audience, and share some of our stories and journeys. So, thank you, Vera, for presenting Picasa earlier. And uh, I would just add here that over time we have created some real-time monitoring platform, which is based on artificial intelligence, machine learning, but also a lot of local knowledge, for which you will be hearing more today. And we are mainly, as a regional company in the Western Balkans, we are mainly focused on cooperating with companies who want to find how their brand is positioned in the market, competitors, but also we work with large organizations, mainly with US government funded projects such as OTI or USAID's programs and so on. So in this presentation, you will also learn about some of the cooperation we had with Dexis in earlier stages. So slide 2. So how do we build an effective stream of data for good monitoring system? There are no two identical countries in the world. Each country has its own specifics when it comes to the political context, economic development challenges, ethnic structures, cultural differences, and so on. So uh, with this in mind, and also their behavior differs. So when it comes to how people find their information, their news, how people interact with the major social media platforms, which platform consumes their time, what age and gender is their audience, and so on. So if I would put steps into building a quality stream of data for social listening, this is the first layer of data that I would need actually to learn and understand how a society acts online and what are their behavioral patterns. So before I would take any other step, I would need to understand how channels of mass communication behave, how they bring people to their platforms. Are they too dependent on social media? How many people inform themselves on a daily basis through digital outlets? How much content these digital outlets produce, and how they bring people to their platform. So basically, in the first layer, I would you would really prefer to understand the audience and their reactions in each of the countries. So in some places that we've learned, people prefer to read their news from news aggregators. In some places, Twitter is a dominantly toxic community where the discussion is led by anonymous people, and there are countries where people really rely on taking information from Facebook. Uh, so uh, once you learn how media sources play their role, you also need to understand how people react to this sources' content. So we learned that this requires a consistent monitoring, not just a one-time pool of information. So in that regard, you can tell the impulses that are captured and learn about the audience's behavior. If your monitoring system is based on one data point at a time, you might be missing the entire story. So, further, it will be difficult to measure, weight, or compare or explain the correlation of that data with the universe of all the data you have. So, what if you find one piece of content that is malicious, and your research team wants to evaluate the impact of this malicious content? So how do you weight? How do you measure? How do you compare if this piece of content is is important, or does it have any impact, or whatsoever? So we were asked by our partners to look at people's reactions when it comes to reactions about contents. So what you're seeing is a result of a real-time dashboard that can track the pulse and explain how people react to content that social media and media channels publish on many levels. So on a category wise, individual pieces of contents, social media channels, and so on. So what you can learn from this data, for instance, is that if you know the last two rows of the chart, it's identical number amount of media outlets and that push content about technology and opinions and editorials. But then opinions and editorials show 10% more engagement on average than the technology news. And this is an annual report, so this is a wider pattern, if I may say. So you can conclude many things here, but at least you can conclude for a start that people enjoy listening to user-generated or hear about user-generated content on one side, but on the other side, they don't prefer the technology news from local domestic media outlets. So speaking, what you are seeing is speaking about North Macedonia data right now, but it's just an example that how data can be structured in a way to have a valuable data. Once you've please, can you, David, move to the next slide? Yeah. So let's have a look at the real case scenario in North Macedonia for the past 5 months. So there is an then you see both topic activity fall. So you have a new topic, which is the Russian-Ukrainian conflict. What you are seeing is the media outlet, how much they push content volume-wise. But let's have a look also at how people react to this content. It's obvious. So on the second tab now here, you're watching the engagement of people about the topics you saw just earlier. So if you see, people really cared about the energy crisis only for a few weeks in the beginning of it, but then the interest was decreased. But then you have some spike in conversation about Djokovic, which I don't know if this audience is aware about, but it was a huge debate. Him not allowed to participate the Australia Open, and then you just start seeing how much the people react on the Russian-Ukrainian conflict domestically. I mean, you have social media channels, you have Facebook, Twitter, and how people react to activities there as well. You can also hear what influencers have to say under this tab. So if I was about to benchmark these events with other events that are heavier, for instance, the COVID-19 vaccination topic. COVID-19 vaccine topic, which is dominantly for a longer period a topic that is discussed in media outlets and social media channels. So now you can see that how these other topics can be benchmarked to something that is even more, let's say, dominant across channels. But when it comes to how people react to this topic, because you are now seeing the volume of information that media outlets push, is the engagement ratio of information, and you see big differences. I mean, the patterns that media outlets tends to push certain information and how people react to this information, very often it's not. You see lately people expressing a lot of interest for the Russia-Ukraine conflict in North Macedonia, which is even much larger than any of the debate in the past 5 months for the vaccination process, which is one of issues and challenges we have. So having in mind all this data and the structure and how you can build a structure that will give you a better picture for each of the topics, through all the statistics and all the additional information you can, for instance, the engagement ratio, what are the channels, who are these media outlets that push the topic. So you can learn how media outlets and social media channels talk about certain issues. So the overall statistics and benchmarks will help us determine findings for the next step of the analysis, which is to detect the patterns, to detect and find the malicious contents, to detect propaganda, and so on. Interesting, creating the predictive models that can help you find some events that might happen in the please, David, the next slide. Yeah. So what are you seeing here is how in the past several years we have worked intensively to help partners understand and explain certain patterns of how people game the social media ecosystem to spread malicious content. So savvy use of technology and emotion-based information helps content become massive and viral. We have identified lots of techniques so far, and there is a new technique every day that comes into place. We have just put here a few examples of how people trick the algorithms of social media, and once you put a content online and the reactions on the first people to see the content will determine the penetration in the next phases. So with enough orchestrated human bots or other ways of clicking armies of people, whether they are bots or human bots, people can achieve having some topics being dominant in the social media debate across all the channels, and even with additional efforts, people can achieve having mainstream events being covered by something else which social media considers as important at the moment because a lot of people have reacted on it. So these are just few of the examples that we have discovered in the past. So there are new techniques every day. There are new discoveries also every day. So we work intensively in creating this platform that will automatically spot and tell you that there is a potential of some malicious content somewhere on internet on the market. Yeah. So thank you for the attention. This was this was part of my presentation for now. So I'll be happy to answer any questions when you have.
Great. Thank you so very much, Norek. This was amazing. It's really important to know, I think, I think social listening, it can just provide such valuable context to particularly when addressing a lot of these issues, whether it's disinformation, misinformation, hate speech, and how it's important to also what you showed, what it does, it you can see the patterns and narratives and also localize it, right? I think for me, what's also really, really important in your presentation and this discussion, which I hope we're going to have on the broader set of issues here, is um, the impact to the people, because I do think it's one needed tool that we can actually use to actually understand the impact to the population itself. So this was great. I want to turn over to Derek now, and I'm very much looking forward to hearing a little bit about the work I know you've done with NDI, and just everything about kind of creating responsible ML data science tech interventions, and how do you actually integrate stakeholders into the design process, detecting some of the stuff, and how you've been actually working with different partners on the ground on this set of issues. So Derek, over to you, take it away.
Perfect. Thanks, Vera. And thank you everybody for attending the session and for the opportunity to be here. So, the framing question or the framing ideas that actually brought us all to this session are things like hate speech, misinformation, disinformation, and any one of those as a concept, when we say it, I think that we can all get behind wanting to make sure that we get rid of it. But the reality is that when one of us says hate speech, or when we say hate speech, the reality is that all of us have something slightly different in our minds. And that is one of the most challenging realities that we have to deal with when we work in this space. And when we start talking about technical solutions for this, this is one of the most important places where tech fails. And that's simply because tech is trying to actually create one understanding of this, when in reality, the notion of what is hate speech or what is misinformation, it is personal, but it's also deeply cultural, it's regional. And so when we do work on these topics, we have to be very sensitive to that reality. And so that's what I want to talk a bit about in the next 5 minutes, which is simply to say that when we work on building tech for these purposes, it's very important that we're mindful of engaging participants and stakeholders that have lived experience with these phenomena. And I say that not simply out of some sort of progressive, wanting to be inclusive notion. I think that that's sort of an important value that we all hold, but there are actually very pragmatic implications of ensuring that we have that kind of approach. And that is that involving individuals who have lived experience deeply in this kind of work increases the accuracy of underlying data science work, and it increases our understanding and collective understanding of the actual problem that we're trying to solve. And I think so often that's something that is completely missing from even very well-intentioned efforts to tackle these kinds of problems. I have to say, the more that I work on this, the more that I realize that some level of collective understanding is always missing from this work, no matter how hard we try. But what we always need to do as people working to either understand or to affect change in these spaces is to move as far as we can towards a real understanding and a real engagement with the underlying problem. And so that's why I'm so keen to discuss this and share this, and also to get feedback and to hear experience that some of you as participants have had with this as well. I wanted to give some example from work that we've done, as Vera alluded to, at the NDI on gendered violence in different country contexts. And as part of that, we were brought into this project as a partner that was doing the data science work. But a lot of the work that we did, and what I want to underscore, was actually non-traditional data science. We spent a lot of effort and a lot of time building lexicons that would help us actually understand the gendered online violence that was going on in these particular countries. So with that said, that's sort of the context for this. Let me kind of let's talk a bit about what this lexicon is and why it's a problem. So suppose that we actually want to detect hateful or violent language in Indonesia, which is one of the countries that we had worked in. That is a very hard problem computationally. So if we want to find sort of all the social media that contains, or a lot of representative social media that contains violent or hateful language, it's a very hard problem. In my day job, when I'm not doing work at Chi, I'm a professor of computer science of applied machine learning, and there we have been working on these kinds of problems for over a decade. So machines are not very good at this. And the reality is that in order to even have a chance of collecting this kind of data at scale, we need the computer, the algorithms really need help. And they need help typically in the form of being given words and phrases that are representative of the kind of language that it needs to look for. And so that enters the lexicon. Basically, a huge list, typically organized list of words and phrases that characterize different kinds of, in this case, hateful language. But in other projects we've worked on misinformation, and so we can look at misinformation language, or we can look at gendered language. We can look at a lot of different kinds of language. So you can build a lexicon around any of these. The question, though, of course, is how do you get the words for a lexicon? So We want this massive list. We want it to be representative. There's no perfect way to do it. But here are a couple approaches that have massive major drawbacks. Approach number one is come up with your own words. That is basically doomed to failure from the very beginning because, it's doomed to failure if I'm involved, because if I'm going to come up with the words for finding hateful, gendered, violent language in Indonesia, I have no hope of identifying that. That's not a community that I belong to. It's not a community that I deeply understand. It's not a lived experience that I have. So anything that I try to come up with, or the variant of this is come up with words and then put them through Google Translate to get like Indonesian versions of it, it doesn't work. You're missing all the cultural context. Another approach that has just disastrously major drawbacks is getting in touch with people in the country and asking them to make these lists for you. And you can provide them as detailed instructions as you want. You can write up huge documents and send it to them and say, hey, find me all the terrible things, terrible ways that people talk about group X in your country. This doesn't work. It does not work very well. And the reason is because these people have no context. It takes time for people to, even those who actually have lived experience with this or have knowledge of it, it takes time for them to grapple with these ideas. And they're incredibly, intensely uncomfortable topics. Nobody sits around wanting to make lists of all the terrible ways that they've been referred to over the years. And so it's a very hard exercise for someone to do in isolation, which is to say, these are the two standard approaches that are quite often taken. And they typically don't work. Unfortunately, they're also the two easiest approaches to solving this problem. So the approach that we've taken, which we found does generate quite representative results, really it requires a lot more work. And I'll be honest about that, which is building a proper lexicon takes an incredible amount of effort. So the issue with both of these sort of seemingly easier approaches is that they don't get stakeholders with lived experience deeply involved enough in the project. What we've found is that it's necessary to take effectively a multi-day workshop approach with in-country participants to get these lexicons built. Now, at this point in my short presentation, it may seem rather strange that a data scientist or a purported data scientist is up here talking about running workshops and so forth. But the reality is that this is a fundamental part of doing any data science project that is going to be representative of the underlying problem. So if we're talking about hate speech in Indonesia, as a data scientist, I can talk about hate speech as much as I want, but in the Indonesian context, I simply don't have the ability to build those models without this kind of help. And so this, to me, is very much part of the data science process. The goal of this multi-day workshop is threefold. First, to build trust within country participants, because if we don't have trust, then we're not going to get any work done. The second is to really commit to building a shared understanding of the objective. And a shared understanding of the objective of the goal of the workshop is a two-way street, because we come in with our own ideas about the way we want this study to be structured, what we think hate speech is defined as. But quite often what we find is that once we get into the workshop, we discover that actually we need to adjust the way that we're thinking about things in order to fit the particular culture, or the cultural context, or the national context, or the communities as they exist. And then finally, the third objective, of course, is building the lexicon itself. So workshops typically are going to take the form of, and I just want to go through this very quickly because I want to leave a lot of time for conversation and other speakers, but the structure of a workshop is typically in day one, you do group introductions, discuss what gendered violence is. And by discuss, I mean really discuss. It's not about us showing up and then telling them what gendered violence is. It's about us sharing our definition and then hearing about all the lived experience that they have, getting their feedback for it. And then discuss the project. So this isn't just about handing these participants a task and expecting them to just give us what we want. independent of what the bigger picture is. It's very important for these participants to know that they're a part of this larger project, and for them to feel as though they're actually part of that and they understand the way that it's being used. And then in day 2, we come up with categories. We finally get down to, I think, what researchers would typically think of as being the sort of the meat of the work, which is come up with the categories of derogatory language. And you'll notice that we haven't built a lexicon yet, because we have to work our way there and build comfort with this. We come up with categories for derogatory language, which means high-level pictures. So what are the kinds of ways that derogatory language is deployed? And then we finally brainstorm the actual lexicon. And so this is where lexicon building happens. And the one thing that I would emphasize is that this is not an objective activity. This is going to bring up a lot of emotion, and there's going to be a lot of sort of group bonding and communication. My experience is that people often respond to it by finding it actually a very meaningful and often a very funny activity, because they're in a room with other people who can identify with them as they're talking about these stories, and they can sort of acknowledge one another's experience, but also acknowledge sort of how ridiculous these words are in the way that they've been deployed. And then finally, after we do the lexicon building, we then test the lexicon by revisiting social media, by seeing how we can find it, seeing what we find there. And then often that actually brings in new ways of understanding the language and new insights. So hopefully this has given a sense for sort of the actual tremendous effort that goes into building a lexicon that really accurately represents what's going on in a particular culture or particular national context. But I would just underscore that it's this kind of effort that actually creates that kind of authentic lexicon that can really do the work that we need it to do, and allow us to uncover the insights and measure the phenomena that we're really after.
Great. Derek, this was phenomenal in the sense of you hit the nail on the head on one very important point, and how much, when we think about data science and social science and even partnering with tech, the one size solution does not fit all, and how much context and language and culture are important, and in the lexicon. I mean, there's no uniform lexicon in this. So with that being said, this was just really, really insightful. I know there's going to be probably a lot of fantastic conversation and discussions, but I just want to keep us on track and on time. And I do want to turn it to Kat. Kat, you've had such amazing experience working on the ground and with your whole teams, and looking at tech and the impact of tech on civil society, on all of these issues. So I am super excited to hear what you have to say on this topic. So over to you.
Thanks, Vera. Well, so first I wanted to start by just telling, I thought maybe we'd pull it up a little bit just to talk about the big rocky systemic challenges that I think a lot of us are grappling with in the space, and that I have over the years consistently seen civil society in particular struggling with, as different organizations try to understand and think through how emerging technologies might provide solutions, where they're going to create harms, how you respond to it, right? It's really, we're all grappling with really difficult problems to begin with. When you add that extra layer on, it can feel really overwhelming. So if there are people in the audience who are looking at all of this being like, whoa, like this is way too technical, I'm just trying to figure out like how I deal with disinformation in this setting, or like I don't even understand where to go, right? And that was a chunk of our audience. I just want to tell you, I want to validate you. Like, you're right. And this is hard. And a lot of it is very confusing and really challenging. And that is a completely fair and justifiable way to feel. So for anyone who is feeling that way, I just want you to know this is a safe space. So I would say some of the systemic challenges that we are really seeing still is there's the supply and demand, right, is completely off in terms of the technological expertise that we need in the space, and the number of people who have the technological expertise necessary to come in with sort of advanced technological and engineering based solutions to some of the problems that we're grappling with It's still just a very nascent field, and it's a young field, and there's still a lot of people who are learning it, and that is going to improve over time. But also the economics of that are still not in favor of civil society because you can make so much more money, but also you can have a lot of impact if you work in these areas and you are going, for example, to big tech companies, right? Or you're going to places that are tapping into millions and millions of people. And so we've seen a lot of the great talent in the field also wanting to be connected to the most cutting edge engineering problems, right? And that can pull them into companies or into research institutes that pulls them away from civil society and these incredibly important challenges that we are trying to solve. So we have a real problem right now still with supply and demand, and that probably is not going to change anytime super soon. There's steep learning curves on all sides, right? There's steep learning curves among the engineers and among the data scientists. I think, Derek, your point around how would I even access the people I would need to talk to? And if I did, then how would they know how to talk to me, and how would we cross that bridge? It's an incredibly important one. So we have on every side of this equation, if you think of the team that needs to be working together to grapple with some of these issues, we still have immense learning curves for every member of that team right now. And so this is taking time, and the rate of change is happening more quickly than the rate of learning can. The incentives aren't necessarily aligned, especially when you look at the big tech platforms and the big tech companies. So long as engagement equals revenue, we are going to struggle because engagement is rarely going to equal a more peaceful or a less volatile online space. And we know that volatile and unpeaceful online spaces contribute directly to volatile and violent offline spaces. There's a lack of standardized operational models across the board with funders, with implementers, with companies, with universities across the board. People are still trying to figure out the how of it. Literally in terms of the operational components. How do you fund it? What does it look like? How do you manage expectations? Which funders are doing what? How do you frame it? How do you think about impact? Who needs to work together? These are all really thorny questions. Funders, private and public, really struggle to address highly intersectional areas and challenges. And this is an extraordinarily intersectional challenge and area right now. You're talking about, the same problems from a sort of engineering standpoint, but these same problems are having impacts across conflict resolution spaces, across free expression, across democracy promotion, across humanitarian crises, across public health, across international trade, across internet governance. It's a vast area. And so we don't really have government funders or private philanthropies that are set up to do very broad cross-cutting work against all of those areas, nor do we have civil society necessarily set up to be able to work together across such vast cross-cutting areas. And so I think that can make it harder to come to larger systematic solutions that might sort of lift all ships. So those are a few of the consistent challenges that no matter what we see going on and no matter what great and interesting work we see out there, in the implementation of it and the getting it funded and the getting it implemented and getting it operationalized and getting people to talk to each other and getting change to happen, we continue to bump up against these realities. And so for anyone who has been struggling with that, I just want to say it's real, it's pervasive. And these are questions that need attention, because we have to be able to operationalize collaboration. We have to be able to operationalize research if we're going to be able to come up with stronger solutions in our spaces. That said, there's 3 models that I thought I could point to of some really interesting work that's happened in the past year or so that I think are bright spots on the horizon, and that I thought for this audience in particular might be interesting because they're the types of programs that might be useful to you in a wide range of spaces. And so with that, if we can go to the next slide. The first one I wanted to highlight is a new project. Well, it's newly public, but it's been going on for about 3.5 years. It's coming out of Duke University's DevLab. And so it's their Machine Learning for Peace project. This is a project that has is part of a consortium that is USAID funded, that is global. The consortium includes Internews, where I used to work. And this is a project that I helped launch way back in the day. It involves global partners. It involves the International Center for Not-for-Profit Law, Results for Development, and then a number of local partners around the world, all working together in a consortium to do research and learning around the closing of civic spaces and how the foreign assistance community might be able to respond more effectively, and how implementers might be able to respond more effectively to closing civic spaces. And so if we can go to the next slide. This project started 3.5 years ago, and very much, I think, Derek, to your point around these things take time. We only, and Duke only publicly launched the sort of first findings of this and the first body of work in December at the Open Government Partnership. So this has been getting cooked for 3.5 years just to get it to the point that it is at right now. What Duke has been attempting to do is see if it can take really cutting edge natural language processing, as well as very innovative operational approaches to working with civil society, local civil society groups on the ground, and do machine learning against a very large corpus of information to see if they can predict when civic space might shift. So are protests going to increase? Would arrests be, would they think that arrests might increase, in 3 months or in 6 months? Do they think there's going to be a spike in unrest? And so it is still a research exercise. No one is going out there and saying, these are predictions and you can rely on them. But it is a really interesting project that I think takes a new approach to how we can think about machine learning in this space, right? And how we can think about AI as a tool that helps us aggregate information that our individual human minds may not be great at examining its scale. And so what they've done for the past 3.5 years is build a massive data pipeline using local and international sources. And then they are classifying that, and I'm not going to get too into the ML for anybody, but they are classifying things based on events. And those events are broken down into what they call civic space events, and then resurgent authoritarian influence events. And those events capture the efforts of authoritarian regimes to wield influence on developing countries as well. So you could think about that as like different laws dropping, for example, right? You could think about protests. You could think about mass arrests. You could think about, curfews being established. There's lots of different events. Then what they're doing is they're looking for patterns in that data. And then through that, they're trying to generate these forecasts. And so they're also including in economic data, which I think is really important. And we haven't seen a lot of that nexus yet happening in a bunch of the research that exists in the democracy, rights, and governance space. And they've put in very robust measures to be able to work with local civil society consistently in the environments in which they are doing this analysis. One of the things I think is really interesting about what they've been doing right now is when you think about the data pipeline that they've been using, they're scraping current news and they're scraping historical archives as well, but they're looking very closely both at international news sources and they're looking very closely at domestic news sources. And they've carefully curated those domestic news sources through input from local organizations and local experts. They started out trying to use Twitter's API, which a lot of people do, and the signal to noise ratio was too great. It was too much information, and there wasn't enough quality in the information for them to really be able to rely on it. And so it was really interesting. That's one of the most common tools that we see a lot of researchers look to among the big tech companies because it is open and because it's accessible. And Duke attempted to work with it and then deliberately moved away from it because they were just finding it so ineffective. Can we go to let's see, one. Oh yeah, sorry. The one thing I also just wanted to say quickly on looking at domestic and international sources is they had a couple of key findings in doing that I just think might be interesting to people in this audience. One, the volume of international news sources on civic space is dwarfed by national sources. So even in countries with really shallow media markets, international sources will provide across the board very scant coverage, and they will provide too little coverage to systematically evaluate civic space. So you really need to have those local sources in the mix in order to create a corpus that, to Derek's point, is large enough to actually support your analysis. Another interesting finding was that national news coverage of civic space was consistent over time. And international coverage in most countries was highly episodic, and it was really driven by major events. And I think I think many of us feel this, but it's nice to see it actually empirically produced, right? And tracked. And national and international sources are also covering different dimensions of civic space. And I think for those of us who are looking at areas of peacekeeping and conflict and are doing remote monitoring, like from HQ centers, for example, this is a really important point to keep in mind. So international news sources are covering elections, they're covering conflictual events, such as civic violence and protests, at higher rates than national sources are. And international sources are underreporting on the day-to-day political and legal and civic activities that tend to underpin civic space. So events like the removal and replacement of government officials and arrests are much more frequently covered in national media. And so again, as folks here are trying to use, for example, even social media listening, right, or different monitoring organizations to help them understand what might be happening in any local environment, one question that's really good to ask is, well, what are your sources? And does it include enough domestic sources for us to get a full picture of what's happening? And finally, in repressed media environments, this is not surprising, international news covers relatively more contentious civic space activity than national news sources are going to, which I don't think is a surprise to anyone who would be in this audience. Another thing that I think is really important to note here is that for artificial intelligence and for machine learning, everyone I think is aware that bias within data sets is a resounding concern, right? And so one of the ways that Duke has been approaching bias reduction and bias mitigation is by having surveys of local experts, by doing research on the sentiment of different media sources. So since media sources are providing a lot of the basis for the data, they're doing analysis of those media sources first so they understand their political bent, what they might cover, what they might not cover, and so that they can extrapolate for that. They're also weighting state-run and independent media sources accordingly, since state-run media sources are, in many instances, going to be more prone to favor a government than an independent media source might. And they're also really looking into how machine learning models can learn from biased or absent reporting as well.
Great.
So the lack of things showing up can also be important information. And so those are some of the ways that they have been systematically approaching bias reduction throughout. And they're doing all of that in partnership with different local actors and local experts through this broader consortium. And so to close this part out, I just wanted to say the website, and I can drop the website into the chat actually for everyone to take a look at. The website is currently doing forecasts for 23 different countries. So you can go in and play around with it if you want and see what they're forecasting.
Fascinating. That is really fascinating.
And it's fun to mess around with, honestly. And if you think they're dramatically wrong, you can send them an angry note. But I'm sure they'll love me for saying that. But so you can check that out. But one of the big takeaways for me from this particular project is going back to that operational question, because this approach is not only informing how machine learning research can look right now and the types of areas or questions that we're grappling with, right? But it also highlights the care and the time and the rigor that is necessary to develop this type of build, right? And so, I mean, this is 3.5 years of work. And it has involved not only having people who have really deep expertise in artificial intelligence and natural language processing and new advancements in natural language processing, but it's also involved very close collaboration with INGOs that had very deep and very large networks of local partners all over the world, and who also had a strong operational capacity to fund those local actors to do this work and to support this work, right? So that they were, so that their expertise was being acknowledged, and compensated and not exploited. And there's also been
Absolutely.
a great deal of emphasis on building trust and supporting knowledge sharing. Exactly, Derek, to your point, right? Between a US based academic team, for example, that's driving a bunch of this work, and the many different local civil society actors who are contributing in their information and their knowledge. And this project, finally, this project was framed by USAID as a research and learning project. It was large, it's well funded, and its purpose was research and learning. And I think that that is a critical component here, and something that many in this audience could push for within their own philanthropic spaces. Because when it is funded as a research and learning project, it creates space and tolerance for failure. It also creates space and tolerance for the amount of time that is required to do this with some care. And a lot of funders haven't given the duration of time or the duration of funding necessary, to achieve that. And so I think framing things as research and learning as opposed to doing, right, or solving, is a really important way that we can adjust expectations from the outset to move some of these questions forward. I know we're so short on time, so I'm going to run through the last two examples very quickly. They're less complicated.
Yeah, I'm going to ask you to do it in very, very short amount of time, just because we're a bit over.
Yep. Next slide. So the next, I just want to flag for you all, Digital Forensics Research Lab at the Atlantic Council is an amazing organization working on disinformation analytics all across the world with research units across 4 different continents. And one of the programs that they have is Digital Sherlocks. And the mission of Digital Sherlocks is really to increase knowledge and expertise among civil society partners all over the world in terms of analyzing and examining things like disinformation and media literacy. So next slide. If people are interested in this, it's open to media, journalists, civil society members, and NGOs. It's not open to governments or for-profit organizations. You can apply through the Digital Forensics Research Lab website. It's a short and easy application process. And if you can go to the next slide. To date, over the past couple of years, they've trained 895 journalists, students, and civil society professionals around the world in free online courses on media literacy, on open source investigative techniques, fact-checking and source verification, narrative analysis, social media monitoring, and so many other topics. And so I think this is a great example as well of the type of operational approach that is really needed if we're going to start diminishing that gap between technological expertise around the world. Because what they're really training people all around the world to do is to then work with organizations like DFR Lab, who have a channel out to the tech companies and who can get them to pay attention and focus in on analytics that are driven by local actors. So it's a great program, and I really recommend that you check it out. And then finally, last example. You might have seen when Afghanistan was falling in July and August. You might have seen some news that Facebook had rolled out a new tool to help keep people in Afghanistan safe. It allowed them to lock their profile and do some other things with the touch of one button. And I think this is just a notable example because that whole tool came from a tool that Facebook developed for Myanmar, because Facebook had invested millions of dollars of working directly with civil society in Myanmar after the genocide to understand what had happened and then to try to ensure that their platform couldn't have the same effects, the same harmful effects that it had had before there. So Myanmar is an area where Facebook invested a ton of money, resources, time, and expertise. And in part of doing that, in working with local civil society, they built product. They didn't just build policies, they didn't just build content moderation stances, but they built product based on what civil society was telling them they needed in their own environment. And that product was something like this lock profile tool. And what was amazing to me about this is that when Facebook built that tool, within 3-4 months of them launching it in Myanmar, Afghanistan happened, and Facebook was able to get that tool operational in Afghanistan in less than a week. And that to me is a great example of big tech actually doing a good job of working with civil society to identify tools that are informed and centered by civil society and that help keep civil society safe in these highly volatile spaces. And so anyway, I'm done, but I hope that those were I hope those will be useful projects that people can look to in their own environments as well.
This is amazing. I know, I mean, I have so many questions from also Kat's presentation as well, because she's also laid out so many amazing resources on partnering, with tech and different solutions. And again, back to what we were talking about, how much localized solutions matter and context matters. I always feel like I keep on coming back to that point just because the one size fits all approach doesn't work. In the interest of time, I do want to take some time and I invite audience to ask, to put some questions in the chat. And I would love to get, I know I have plenty of questions myself, but I would really love to have the opportunity for the audience to ask some questions here as well. I saw one that I'll just repeat. I think Derek answered it, but which was about if data science could address violent crime, incarceration related categories, and if so, how? And Derek mentioned it is one of the many tools that can be used. But I just want to give the floor to the audience to, if there's a question, a burning question from these presentations, from this discussion that you want to ask. Also, here's one. So peace builders tend not to have the technical expertise that this amazing panel do. How do we take ideas like Derek's into our work? So how do we take some of the technical, and then Norik, I would even ask the same question to you in terms of also like social listening, and then Kat, you've also been on the ground as well. So how do you take some of those technical expertise that you do and apply, that you guys do, and how can it be applied to peace building? So maybe I'll on this one, I'm going to have quickly Derek and Norik answer that one.
Yeah, it can be a challenge, and I appreciated Kat's point that we have to acknowledge that this is not going to be a comfort area for everyone. And also to the other question I was asked, it's not the only tool that's out there. So it's just one of many that can be used. I think to directly approach this, there's a couple avenues that you have. The first is you can of course look for partners to work with. I mean, like Kai, my organization, there are many, or basically all the organizations represented here on the panel. The other option, and this is one that I really do encourage, is connecting with your local tech community, because there are a lot of technical folks out there that are looking to do meaningful work, but may not themselves be highly aware or plugged into that. And so, anything from, running a hackathon with a local tech group, or just meeting with local tech leaders to make them aware that these are issues that need attention, can actually galvanize conversations and some support for this. Though I do think that it's important to acknowledge that often when getting technical folks involved, it's important to know how to manage them, because if they're not given enough direction, they will kind of work on whatever they think the problem is. And that interface, that communication interface, is probably, to me, that it's the issue that holds most data science and machine learning work back. And so there really has to be a lot of effort put into communicating with the technical folks to actually get them to understand the actual problem to work on.
I'm going to take one more audience question. Just would love to, engage with the audience here. And that is, how can the UN help with the data science consistency? I know we haven't really talked yet about the UN in all of this. And so I think that actually goes a much bigger question, not just with data science consistency, but also, yeah, Derek, I'm going to start with you in a second, but also.
Can I jump in, because I
Sorry,
actually
yeah.
work with the UN. So Kai works very closely with the World Food Program. So these are agencies that are very bureaucratic, very slow moving, but they do have the capacity to create consistent solutions. I would say it's important to be incredibly patient and just to see that there's a very long game to play when working with UN organizations as a way of creating consistency in the way the data science is applied. It's not going to be something that you turn around immediately, because these organizations are focused on durable, long-lasting interventions. But if there's an opportunity to begin working with them, you have to see it on like year level timescales when you start working with the UN. But there are opportunities. Start local, and work with local UN country offices, and try to actually reach sort of headquarter level visibility, and try to get those solutions some visibility and attention. But again, it just honestly, it's a very long play to deploy there.
I would also
Great.
say the UNHCR innovation team has done some really interesting work in the space, especially around like biodata for refugee communities and asylum seeking communities. And the UN Commissioner for Human Rights has also engaged in this in terms of principles and thought. And finally, the UN will be appointing a new tech envoy in the coming weeks, if coming months, certainly, if not weeks. And so keeping your eye on who the new tech envoy is going to be and how they define their mandate will also be an interesting area, I think, to look at.
That's great. Absolutely. So with that, I want to turn to a few additional questions before we close. Kat, I want to actually start with you, and then I'm going to have a question for Norik. I want to talk about like what are the primary like in all the programs that you've run all over the world, certainly for Internews and beyond. What are the primarily challenges that you have seen and faced in partnering with digital platforms and making sure they partner with civil society and actually implementing programs and solutions on the ground? And I ask that, like, because often is it that when you think about disinformation or you think about online hate speech, you pick the topic, is it the access point to the digital platforms? Is it the sort of the tools? Is it that the tools are not localized fast enough? What would you say? Because I'm curious in terms of what are some of the issues at the local level to address some of these issues that we can, as a community, really focus on digital platforms working on, broadly speaking, agnostic to whichever one.
I would say the biggest problem is that countries and environments and communities that have some of the highest risk of real violence, of real volatility, of real political and economic instability, also are frequently areas or communities that may be operating in multiple different languages, in minority languages, right? Or just simply aren't players on the international stage in a way that the tech companies care about, frankly. Like overwhelmingly, what we've seen is that the tech companies care about avoiding public shaming, right? They have like that has been they say that they care about everyone and everything, but the nuts and bolts of it are that you will get more focus or more traction with the big platforms if you're trying to talk to them about Brazil or India or Mexico than if you're trying to talk to them about, historically, Kyrgyzstan or Central African Republic, right? And so it's highly political in terms of where resources flow inside of the companies and what they're willing to focus on and what they're willing to put their teams towards. And then technologically, there are an enormous number of limitations, right? Their ability to do content moderation and spot things in Russian is very different than their ability to spot it in Kyrgyz. And so, when Myanmar happened, Facebook had, I think, 2 Burmese speakers total in the entire company, right? And Burmese wasn't even a Unicode script, so there are all of these challenges. But I would say it's the fact that it's very hard to get the company's attention, especially for a lot of the most minoritized or a lot of the most vulnerable communities out there that actually need the greatest lift, because the companies are dealing with scale, and some of these problems are somewhat niche, right, in terms of their languages or the specificity of it, and those two things are not necessarily in alignment. And the other overwhelming challenge is civil society is spread too thin. Civil society is being asked to just, be an expert for this platform and like do a consultation for that platform, and then
Yeah.
provide feedback on this thing and provide feedback for that thing, and they're
They
all
can only do
everybody's
so
trying-
much.
Everybody's trying to do their own job to begin with. And their
That's right.
job
They
is
can only
not
do so much.
to be an unpaid consultant, essentially, for a massive corporation. And so there's this immense desire on the part of civil society across the world to be flagging this, to be heard, to get attention, to be part of a solution. And overwhelmingly, their contributions land in a black box. They don't hear back. They don't know what the impact was. And the companies have no proprietary interest or a legal requirement to share back what that impact was,
Absolutely.
or if they
No.
took it on board.
Yeah.
Right. And so that's another, we see it across the board. And the companies will tend to push out things like, oh, we did all this research, and then if you dig into it, you'll find out that it's well, they did it in the United States.
Yeah, no, there's there's a lot, and this is why my earlier comment. This is it's hard. Addressing online harms is hard for multiple dimensions, and we talk about whole of society approach, but how much that whole of society approach needs to be perfected, and how implementation is hard, and you just pointed out to the exact, real, genuine reasons why. So
I would be right.
yeah.
I just would caveat. There are two areas where I think that the operational elements are more mature.
Yeah,
And have been going for longer, and that's in counterterrorism and in child pornography.
Yes,
And those
that's
are two areas, because there are a lot more laws that actually govern them specifically. Those are two areas where you do see deeper and more mature practices and operational models.
We have the Global Internet Forum for Counterterrorism is one example of that. Absolutely. So Norik, I would love to turn to you, and it's for you. What do you look for in designing a compelling data query? Like, how do your partners measure the impact of activities that you use data to mitigate distrust or offline conflict as a result of disinformation, for example? Again, I think it's, what's interesting here, it's kind of like the impact that it has on the, like, how do you actually measure the impact that it's having on the population?
Well, thank you. Thank you for the question, but I don't think there is a right or wrong answer to this. And it's all to us, to our expertise, which is really local and regional in the Balkans, Western Balkans. So I can only talk about those few countries that we have tested this, and doesn't mean that it will apply anywhere else. But first, to our understanding, to measure an impact of one piece of content or entire message or disinformation, to us, it's important first to understand the entire universe of data and everything that flows to everyone online. So, and this is hard. To get all this information gathered in one place is hard, but it's not something that is undoable. So, yes, you can do it. You can gather all this data. At our system, just to scale the size, on a daily basis, we collect around 50,000 news that media outlets publish. So within this 50,000 news, you would measure the impact of each content individually, and then you would group them into topics, and then you would group them into categories and sources of information, and so on and so on. So once you have this all net of information flow on a daily basis, on a real-time basis, then you can say that you can do certain type of measurement of another piece of content which you will pick from this whole universe of data. So this is the approach that we are using. Doesn't mean that it's applicable everywhere. There are countries where the information flow is on a much bigger scale. But to us, I mean, this approach gives a lot of results. You can at any time find this piece of content that you want to measure, and you can tell immediately the impact. So yes, on a smaller countries, it's, to us, it seems like more easier and doable thing.
No, absolutely. I want to ask a question, and this is really for all of you. And after this, just in the interest of time, if the audience has one more question, I'm happy to entertain that as well. And perhaps this is sort of one of the concluding questions. What three pieces, and we'll just kind of go around the circle again, or my virtual circle here, which is then Derek, Kat, and then Norik. What three pieces of advice would you give organizations working on these sets of issues: disinformation, online hate speech, online harm, the propensity for offline harm as well? So what three pieces of advice would you give organizations working on these set of issues in terms of detection online for the first time? Derek.
Three. Well, I think my first one would be collect a large data set that characterizes the problem that you have. And the reason is because it's a very powerful communication device. It also helps everyone become clear on what the problem is that you're trying to tackle. So if you're trying to detect hate speech, what does that hate speech actually look like? And you'll find that forcing yourself to actually collect the content will help you become more, bring you to a better understanding of what it is that you're actually looking for. That data set that can then become something that you can work with tech partners on. It'll be something that you can use as a communication device with other groups. And again, as I said, it'll also become something that simply is a learning for your organization. And I would venture to say would definitely give you actionable insights. It is no small undertaking to do, but it also doesn't require being a computer programmer. It's something that a team of people who have lived experience with this can do, and can build off of. So that's my one, but you asked for three. Maybe we can get one from each person.
Great. Kat, over to you. I see Kat posted counterdisinformation.org. That's a really good guide with a lot of set of interventions and best practices, which I know.
Yeah, that guide is just something that people can pop into if they want to get a better sense of how different projects around the world, right? And what they've looked like, and if you wanted to reach out to somebody and find out like what they did, right? Because if there's someone who's already done something akin to what you're interested in, asking to build off their rubric, right? Asking for their lessons learned, probably likely to save you a lot of time. And I would say that overwhelmingly you find that people in the space are incredibly generous with their knowledge and universally want to move the ball forward. In terms of advice, I think this goes back to the person who asked the question around like peacekeepers don't have the same expertise, right? How would we sort of get involved? I think my biggest piece of advice would be do not discount your own expertise, right? These are just different pockets of expertise, but you have expertise in peacekeeping, and that's an incredibly technical and important area that most data scientists and machine learning experts know nothing about. You are the ones who understand the data that matters, right? Like the sources who can be trusted, the sources who can't be trusted, the context behind it, right? So do not discount the importance of having subject matter expertise in an important subject area, and also following your gut. Like if something seems really off, you can just sort of dig into it and track it. And what you'll actually, a lot of the organizations that are doing deep analysis of influence operations, they're not using highly sophisticated technology to do it. They're just kind of digging, right? And tracking to sort of get the breadcrumbs. And then from there, I think to Derek's point with that, taking that body of knowledge or that trail to someone and saying, this feels off to me, or I think this, could you look at this? Could this be that? right? That's the kind of trail that you can give to like a, digital forensics research lab or a Graphica or some other organizations that work in these areas who can maybe put some more advanced analytics against it and say like, oh yeah, there may be something here, right? So that's the other thing I would say is like, listen to your spidey sense. Like, your space, your area, your context. Don't be intimidated by the cybers and the techiness of it all. Like a lot of that is just a language. It's just a lexicon and it's just about becoming familiar with it. But
And in fact, that
don't
yeah,
discount yourself as a core and centering element within that analysis.
and I'll double down on what Kat is saying. I think this is where the bridge needs to be built and strengthened, and especially in kind of local communities as well, because there's often I think sort of the data science and the techie side of the world can really benefit from this.
Ooh, Vera, I'm so sorry. Can I add one other thing?
Yeah, of course.
Okay, this is really like it's for everybody, but it's really specific to my ladies who are in this room. Okay, if there is a dude data scientist who cannot explain to you clearly what he's doing, why he's doing it, right, or what is happening behind it, shop around for a different person, right? There are so many people in this space who weaponize technological language in order to avoid accountability for not really knowing what they're talking about. It is not on you because you don't understand them. It is on them. If they understand it well enough, they will be able to explain it clearly. So
Truth to power.
do not be intimidated. Just be like, nope, no thank you, next, and find yourself a different data scientist. This is extremely important for my ladies. Sorry, I'm done.
Truth to power. Norik, I think you have the last word.
Yeah, so my pieces of advice would be like, if you really want to understand the vulnerability of your group to exposure of misinformation, disinformation, then you would really like to understand the emotion to which they are vulnerable. Because what we've learned in all these years of tracking down all the toxic content that spreads throughout internet, there is always some emotion to which this information is related or connected, because otherwise it won't have any engagement. Otherwise it won't pop up to the conversation. It will not have the success of being as important as it looks like to us if the numbers were not there. So and then from there you can create better shields to vulnerability of people towards this disinformation, because once you know the emotion where they will be attacked, in that regard you can create your maybe some kind of shields or protections. And another, which is related to what Juscat said, is that you need to also, I mean, this the conversation with the tech people should be two-sided. You will not expect that tech people will understand you without you telling them first what you need, because you very often you will find yourself in a position that you are talking about two different things all the time, as Kat said. So maybe they won't understand you. So I think these conversations should be closer, and you should really work closer with these guys so they will understand what you need, and then they might come with some solutions.
Great. Well, on that note, we're just on time. And I want to thank our panelists, Derek, Kat, and Norik, for a fascinating and wonderful discussion. As you can tell, there's so many directions we could go on these sets of questions. And I invite you, first of all, to continue the conversation. Certainly follow all of them, follow Dexis on Twitter. And, to reiterate the last point that Kat, I think it was both Kat and Derek mentioned as well, your voice and your views matter very much. And there's this connective tissue between sort of the technical side of things or the technical experts and the folks on the ground who really understand these issues. So thank you all very much, and have a lovely rest of the day, wherever you are.